Amazon's culture is we pay you, work really hard, you'll be part of something very successful. How you're feeling today? Why don't you not bring that up because we don't care. Now, of course, they never say that because that would sound bad, but definitely people learn to understand Amazon really doesn't care how you feel about your job. They care about how well you're doing.
Today, we are back with Ethan Evans for part 2 of our conversation. If you missed the first episode, let me tell you a little bit about Ethan. He spent over 15 years at Amazon, leading global teams and helping shape iconic products like Prime Video, Amazon App Store, and Prime Gaming. He then retired as a vice president in 2020 and has since dedicated his time to coaching and helping others thrive. In this episode, we dive deep into something that has shaped Amazon's culture, its leadership principles. Ethan takes us behind the scenes to share how these principles influence decision-making, leadership, and innovation at one of the world's most successful companies. If you're curious about what makes Amazon tick, how to lead like the best, and how these principles can transform your own career, this episode is a must listen. How do you keep leaders and people accountable?
It begins with the CEO. He holds his team accountable and then it ripples down from there.
16 principles. How do you put them in practice?
That's where I think, honestly, is the magic of Amazon. Amazon did 3 things to push them into daily use. First, whenever we interview anyone for a job, the interview assignments are broken down by leadership principles. The second place is in your annual review. And then the final place they show up.
Hi, Ethan. I'm so happy to have you back, and thank you very much for agreeing to have part 2 of our podcast.
I'm very happy to be back and have a chance to talk to you again. You asked such great questions. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I'm looking forward to what I know you have lined up today.
Yes, so today we are going to talk about the Amazon leadership principles. Nowadays, everybody talk about culture and how difficult it is to create a great culture and how easy it is to ruin a culture. And among all this talk, Amazon is doing that day in and day out. They have great culture for years. So let's unpack that for people and provide really great material for people to learn and apply whatever they learned from Amazon. But the first things first. So what are these principles? We talk about the Amazon principles about leadership, but what are they?
Right. So for at least 20 years, Amazon has had a list of leadership principles. The list started as 14, has been expanded to 16. It's been modified a few times. But these principles, even though they're called leadership principles, everyone at Amazon is assumed to be a leader of something. So leader doesn't mean just manager. It means whatever you're doing, you're leading in that function and you're influencing others and influencing the direction of the company. And so it's the set of principles that explain how Amazon wants you to lead and that captures the culture of how the company is intended to operate.
Who created them?
It's a good question. When I first joined Amazon in 2005, there were actually 3 different lists. One of them was called leadership principles, but it was shorter. And there were 2 others that were called things like cultural values and something else. And shortly after I got there, they had created these 3 lists had grown somewhat organically as the leaders of the company, the founder and his team, wrote down things they thought were important. But shortly after I got there, all of these lists got merged into one. And ever since, we've had only the list of leadership principles.
Let's go through them. Can we go through them one by one? And
Sure.
Introduce them shortly, and then we'll dive into more details.
So I admit, while I know them all, I don't have them all memorized in order. And they are actually in an order. So I'm going to pull them up, which you can do just if you Google Amazon leadership principles, you'll end up with them. So, yeah, the first one is customer obsession. And I see now Amazon has updated the website. It looks like they have the new CEO, Andy Jassy, talking about each one, which
Okay.
is great. But they haven't changed the order. So, customer obsession says leadership starts with the customer and works backwards. They work vigorously to earn and keep customer trust. Although leaders pay attention to competitors, they obsess over customers. So, where this principle comes from is Jeff Bezos, the founder, used to have a tradition of putting an empty chair at every meeting table and saying, this chair, you have to imagine our customer is sitting in it. And if our customer was listening to our meeting, what would they say? What would they want us to do if they were hearing the meeting we're having? And that's really where customer obsession came from. And I think the rest of this principle, as Jeff says, is about not getting caught up in what competitors are doing. Just focus on doing what your customers need, and competitors will do whatever they do, but we'll be fine. So I'll just check with you. Do you want me to go into that amount of depth on each one, more, less?
No, I think maybe if you summarize them kind of as a group,
As a
because
group.
going through every single one
Okay.
and 16
Takes
will
a
be too
long
much,
time.
right?
Yeah.
Takes a long time. But that one about customer obsession is important because it is, I mean, this is something that everybody talks about and applies, right? And it's quoted so many times. If you can just go through the rest and just group them in some order that you think it works, so people who watch and listen can understand.
So I would say it's important. I'll do that. Customer obsession is first because the idea was, the reason it's listed first is that that's where everything begins. Begin with thinking about the customer. Then there are 12 that are, the next 12 are all about how you do things to get to the 14th principle, which is deliver results. And for a long time, there were only 14. Deliver results was considered to be the end, because the point was, if you're not delivering some result that the customer can use, it doesn't matter. The 12 in the middle were, how do you do that? So I'll just quickly say, the list of those is ownership, invent and simplify, are right a lot, learn and be curious, hire and develop the best, insist on the highest standards, think big, bias for action, frugality, earn trust, dive deep, have backbone, disagree, and commit, and then you get to deliver results. Now, one challenge that we can talk about is this is a lot of principles. Even when I was listing them, it's like, well, that goes on and on. But you do those 12 things and that will lead to great delivery of results, is the theory of the list. And then only a few years ago, about 5 years ago, Amazon added 2 more: strive to be Earth's best employer, and success and scale bring broad responsibility. These 2 additions were made because the company is now so big and successful. They were an acknowledgement that Amazon now has an influential role in the world and how to behave differently as one of Earth's largest corporations.
That's all good, right? I mean, there are many people who can write 16 principles well, but these are slogans. How do you put them in practice? How do you make people understand what is it? I mean, when you say customer obsession, what does it mean for the employee? What does it mean? What do I have to do? So how was this implemented? That's I'm very curious about this.
And that's where I think, honestly, is the magic of Amazon and the magic of these principles. Amazon did 3 things to push them into daily use. So all kinds of companies have a poster in the lunchroom with a bunch of slogans, and nobody pays any attention to it. Amazon made them daily use in 3 ways. First, whenever we interview anyone for a job, the interview assignments are broken down by leadership principle. So every interviewer is given 2 leadership principles to assess the candidate. How well does this person, take ownership or show bias for action and so on. The point of that process is it makes sure that we don't bring in candidates, hopefully, who completely mismatch the culture. But it also tells the person doing the interview, every time they do an interview, it reminds them, we care about this. We care about this. We care about how are people following these principles. The second place we put the same thing is in your annual review, you are given feedback on every principle. So the way it works practically is we do a 360 review where all of your peers and your manager ask about you, and they can choose up to 3 principles they feel you exemplify and up to 3 where they think you can improve. And you get a histogram of those votes. And that usually is pretty revealing because, some principle you're good at, you'll have a lot of positive votes, and something that you struggle with, you'll have a bunch of negative votes. And that makes it easy to figure out, but it also reinforces we measure based on this. And then the final place they show up in the system, baked into Amazon's systems, which is what then drives it into the culture, is they're in all the promotion documents. So whenever we consider anyone to move up, we ask, what are they good at in the context of the leadership principles, and what are they not? So what that does is it makes everyone care. And then the rest of your question, these principles get used as an internal shorthand. So as opposed to giving a whole argument for why I'm doing something, I can just say inside Amazon, well, I'm diving deep, or our team is choosing bias for action on this. And because everyone knows what they mean, I've encapsulated a whole conversation in a few words.
I see. All right. And how do you keep leaders and people accountable? Because you know how easy it is to have a principle, and then this principle kind of waters down, and then there is no principle anymore. How do you keep accountability and continuation of these principles through the years?
Yeah. So to be honest, some people would argue that Amazon has seen them watered down somewhat over the years, right? With being so large. And we can talk some about that and what Amazon is trying to do, as far as I know, to combat that. It begins with the CEO, right? The CEO didn't write every principle when it was Jeff Bezos, and certainly not Andy, but he approved them all. And then he keeps them and he holds his team accountable, and then it ripples down from there. The second way, though, you have accountability is, as I mentioned, it's in your review. So if you're not following one of the principles, usually you will get a lot of negative feedback about that. And because that impacts how you're paid and how you're tracking towards potentially getting a new or better job, that's the enforcement mechanism. The enforcement mechanism is that they are central to the performance review process.
There is another way, actually, situation which shows that the principles are being followed. And this is when, if you apply the principles, the decision you have to take is really tough. And sometimes it might be against yourself, right? You're doing the right thing, but you are not the beneficiary. So,
correct.
Have you had such a situation, and does this work?
Yeah. So Amazon almost has a principle specifically about this. The one, have backbone, disagree, and commit. That whole principle means if you have a strong opinion, you should stand up for it. And if you don't agree with the decision, you should fight and push back. But once a decision is made, whether it's the decision you like or not, you should commit to it. You should support it. Because, if you think of sports teams as an analogy, if people say, well, I don't like the play or I don't like the game tactics, I'm going to do it my own way, the team will clearly lose. So everyone has to go the same direction. Now, for me personally, I've certainly had times where I needed to where I disagreed with what was being chosen as a direction, and I had to go along with it. And that is very painful. there are some other leadership principles I really struggled with. We have two called Think Big and Invent and Simplify. Both of those require employees to be inventive or creative. And when I began my career at Amazon, I took a more of an engineering mindset, which was a little bit less empowered. And I thought, well, my job is to build what I'm told. Like, take the orders, someone else decides what to do and they tell me what to do and I tell them when I can do it and I do it. And it took me a while to understand that I was being asked to lead differently and then start successfully leading that way because I'd never done that.
So principles like, let's say, customer obsession. You said that it's in meetings, there is an empty chair. And I think that's an interesting way to do it, certainly. But it's meetings. What about how do you have this? How does this principle show in small decisions, everyday stuff? How does it manifest?
Yeah, well, let me give you an example of a place where I know that principle is applied and it costs a lot of money. So many people are familiar with Amazon Prime Video. They've watched Amazon TV and movie shows. When we first built that system, the internet was not as good. And so that system launched in 2006. And back then, it was unfortunately common that sometimes your movie would stop in the middle and you'd get the spinner on the screen, buffering. And a decision was made that if someone's movie buffered more than once during them watching it, we would just go ahead and refund them the money for the rental. So we decided, a decision was made that the right thing to do for the customer wasn't to say, well, you finished watching the movie, so we'll keep the money. But instead to say, you know what, we saw that unfortunately your movie buffered multiple times and your viewing experience was interrupted by this spinner and so on. Let's treat you right like we would want to be treated. Now, that was a very expensive decision because we didn't have the right to give back the part of the money that belonged to the movie studio. We have a deal, of course, that says, well, every time we show the movie, maybe we charge $3 and $2 of those dollars go to Disney and $1 of the dollars goes to Amazon. Well, we didn't have the right to give back their $2. So when we decided to give the customers money back, we still had to pay the studio. And that's what made it very, very expensive. But the idea was it's the right thing to do. And the deeper idea is management supported, Jeff Bezos supported the concept of we will make more money from our customers in the long term if we treat them right in the short term. And so when you ask, how did that principle get applied? You had to have faith that the company would back you up for doing the right thing, even if that was expensive in the short term.
I see. Interesting. So what about yourself when you joined the company and you come to Amazon and obviously it's completely different, so many principles. How did you adjust to that environment? Was it difficult? What helped you?
It was difficult. I mean, luckily, I guess when they interviewed me, they did a pretty good job figuring out that my basic attitudes fit with a lot of what Amazon wanted. But there were places where I didn't fit naturally. So I fit ownership really well. And in fact, I helped write the current ownership principle in its current format. I fit bias for action really well because I like to jump in and get things done. Some places I didn't fit as well. Dive Deep talks about how a leader is responsible for staying connected to the details of what's going on in their organization. And as a manager, I sort of thought my job was to float up at the strategic level and give big picture direction and let other people handle the details. And I quickly learned that Amazon didn't see it that way. They said, yes, set the direction, but then get your hands dirty. And you better know what's going on in every corner of your team. And that was a big adjustment. So that's an example where I really had to adjust.
How do this principle encourage innovation? Is it, I mean, there's 16 rules. That's quite a lot, right? So you start thinking, oh, is this okay? Is this not okay? You know what I mean?
So they're not supposed to be, I mean, I get why you call them rules. The idea isn't, there's, maybe you've seen it, right? In Pirates of the Caribbean, at one point, one of the characters says, well, these are the rules of the pirates' code. And the pirate says, well, they're not so much rules as guidelines. The idea here is that these are supposed to give you guidance about how to lead. But in fact, the principles are known to conflict with each other. And that's still intentional. So let me give you an example. One of the principles says, are right a lot. So it's about making correct decisions. And another principle says, have bias for action, move quickly. Well, those two things are often in tension because if I'm focused on speed, I'm not always taking all the time to be perfect. And so they're set up to say, well, both of these things matter. As a leader, you need to balance and you need to think about, when should I be hurrying? When is urgency the right thing? And when should I be cautious? And there are several of these tensions. How do you move forward? It's more, these principles create a style of leadership, and then you lead in that style. But it's not like everything I did, I said, oh, wait, pull out the checklist of 16 things.
Yeah.
It was rather when I needed to do something, I would think about, okay, where does this, like, what is the Amazon way to do this thing I'm about to do? And that's how you develop that sense, is it becomes more of a, you know, to use another movie reference, like Spider-Man's Spidey sense of like, oh, I have a feeling about how to do this.
Yeah. And what happens if there is a leader who has clearly issues with adjusting? How is the mechanism working for such leaders to be, you know, their behavior highlighted and corrected? Because you know about the one bad apple ruins everything else.
Barrel. Yeah. So first, I'd love to tell you that every leader follows these principles or exemplifies them. That's not true. And, you know, when people comment on this video, if they're from Amazon, they'll say, that's totally not true. This leader, that leader. But the way that's intended to work and the way it generally works is, first, the manager above them is responsible for overseeing that and giving them guidance and feedback. That said, they will also tend to get guidance and feedback from their peers, because Amazon's such a big company and you worked in large enterprises. You can't get anything done without the collaboration of your peers. And if you're not following the principles, your peers are going to push back on you and say, well, I can't go along with your plan because whatever, it doesn't show enough ownership, or it is bad for customers, or it never gets to a valuable result. They will push back on you and they will use the leadership principles as their rationale, as opposed to just saying, well, I disagree with you. They will have a because, and that because will be one of these principles.
I see. So shortcuts are very unusual things in Amazon, or hacks.
Well, it's a good question you ask. I definitely lean, in my personal approach to things, I lean towards quick and dirty hacking, which is why I liked the bias for action principle, as I saw it as like, oh, look, permission to hack. But then I would get in trouble where some things I hacked too much, and I ran afoul of either our right a lot or some other principle. And so I would get corrective feedback, right? I would get corrective feedback. I got very dramatic corrective feedback that said, you made the wrong choice here. You were too focused on speed and not enough focused on getting the right outcome, not enough focused on diving deep to check all the details. You were, you drove the car off the road, and sure, you were going fast, but now it's a wreck.
Did living by this principle changed you as a leader, and how?
Absolutely. It changed me as a leader in several ways. The biggest one I've sort of already mentioned, which is I didn't see myself as an inventor. I didn't see that as my job. And now I hold over 70 issued patents. I've started several large businesses for Amazon. And so the principles pushed me to get out of my functional box and start thinking of myself as responsible for the whole business outcome, not just my part. I used to have the idea that as an engineer, if someone else told me what to do and I built it and the market didn't like it, so what? I built it well, right? My job was, to attach widget A to widget B and give you a working widget C. And as long as I did that, I'm a hero. And these principles broke me out of that functional thinking. And I think that thinking occurs in a lot of areas, right? You can have a finance person who thinks, well, I balance the books. Yes, we're losing money. The books look terrible, but they're correct.
Balanced.
Right. So like my job is good, and Amazon doesn't want that type of thinking, and that did change me as a leader.
Amazon was successful for years and continues to be successful. How much this success is based on these principles?
Of course, it's hard to quantify, but I and many people would say most of it, a lot of it. Whether that's truly 60% or a majority, I don't know. But the principles allow a large distributed company to still operate in one fashion. And Amazon is okay with the idea that some people don't want to operate this way. And their perspective is, that's totally fine. You don't have to agree, but you can't work here. And so the idea is, if everyone pulls together in one direction, that will generate very good results. And as you say, it has. Now, it does lead some people to say, well, Amazon is kind of a cult, because you either conform to the culture or, you're thrown out. And there's some truth to that, right? A cult is a negative word, but Amazon has a philosophy, and they're very open to say, it's okay. Like, other companies have other philosophies that also work. Starbucks, another very well-known international company, puts a lot more emphasis on employee wellness historically, and celebrates employee wellness a lot more than Amazon. Amazon's culture is, we pay you, work really hard, you'll be part of something very successful. But like, how you're feeling today? Why don't you not bring that up, because we don't care. Now, of course, they never say that in those words, because that would sound bad. But definitely people learn to understand, Amazon really doesn't care how you feel about your job. They care about how well you're doing it. If you also feel good about it, that's great, but not important. Some people find that very cruel. I understand that.
Yeah.
And in fact, I personally left Amazon in part because I didn't like everything about what the culture implied over time. But I understand it very well, and it's extremely effective. And I would add, the new leader, Andy Jassy, is certainly pushing hard to restore classic Amazon culture. He may not have been successful yet, and some people definitely don't like it, but it's very clear that's what he's trying to do.
I see. And when you say classic culture, what do you mean?
I mean more this focus on deliver results. You're probably familiar with George Orwell's book, Animal Farm. Is this a book you know? So in Animal Farm, there's all these rules, and then the bad animals who take over write this extra rule that says, like rule 3 says all animals are equal, and rule 4 totally changes that and says some animals are more equal than others, which is double speak and changes everything. Well, there was a joke at Amazon that said all the leadership principles are equal, but some are more equal than others. And they were talking about principle 14, deliver results. And the point was, in the end, Amazon cares about the results. And they're not too worried about if that creates long work hours or hard conditions for employees on the way. And I think Andy's been very clear. Everyone has to come back to the office 5 days a week. If you don't like that, please quit. It's fine. If you don't quit, you'll be fired. Like he's had a very strong push for this is a hard-working culture, and be a part of it or don't. But there isn't a third option, which is work here and not do it. That's not an option.
I see.
Yeah.
And how are these principles created? And who says that it's time to review them or to adjust them or something doesn't work? How does this work?
Yeah. So, of course, the company has grown over time, but in the end, the principles are always finalized and accepted by the CEO and his direct leadership team, which is called the S team or the senior team. And that team makes the decision on adding or changing. Now, in the beginning, when the company was smaller and younger, Jeff and a few of his key advisors would have sat together in a room and done this. Now that S team, the last time I looked at it, has 33 members. So I don't think they're sitting in a room of 33 people and doing this. But I do think if they want to change something, all 33 will at least have a chance to say yes or no, or here's my thoughts. So I was part of one change that happened in about 2009. And they were revising the principles. And in that case, one of these S team members came to me and a group of my peers. I was a director in the company at the time. And they actually said, here's the new list of leadership principles. What do you think? And they had eliminated the ownership leadership principle in that edit. And my colleagues and I said, we think ownership is missing. And the leader in question, he was the CEO of our retail wing, Jeff Wilkie, said, well, if you think it's so important, why don't you write it? Why don't you write a draft? So we wrote a draft. We sent it in. It went into a black hole. We never heard any more. But then a few months later, the new versions were announced and some of the words had been changed, but what we submitted was there. So there is a feedback process. Today, what would happen, because I know a little bit about how the most recent principles were added. Today, I have to be honest, I don't think the S team members do any of it personally anymore. They assign some team and they say, well, we think we should investigate having a principle. In this case, it would have been the one about being Earth's best employer. And I think that probably got assigned to some combination of, public relations and human resources to write. And a lot of people criticize these principles as being too PR oriented. They're the wordiest, and they have some people would say they were only written for public appearance.
Consumption. Yeah.
Consumption. But in any case, they were written more by a committee, but then they would have been approved again by that same leadership team. So that's how they were made.
I see. So if there is one principle that every company should have, which one do you think that principle is?
So I'll answer that directly. I will say one of my first managers at the company wrote a book called Working Backwards. And that book, Working Backwards, it's by Colin Breyer and Bill Carr, talks about how you can adapt the leadership principles to any company. Like if you want to make them yourself, it talks about that. And the key is, I wouldn't say every leadership principle fits every company. For me, where I think companies fall down, I would say everyone should have a version of bias for action. And the reason is, I think as companies get bigger, they slow down, they become conservative, they stop getting things done, and they lose track of what business they're in. I've had a very interesting discussion. I have a friend who works at a nuclear power company. And we've talked about, do we really want someone who's working on nuclear power controls to have a bias to move quickly? And of course, the answer there is, well, not too quickly. But it's interesting because he told me his company is struggling with this. They've realized that they're so safety oriented that being safe has paralyzed them from ever doing anything. Because, of course, no action you take is perfectly safe, has zero risks. And so even in this company, they're discussing, how do we be appropriately safe for nuclear power, but still get some things done? So that would be the principle I think goes everywhere. I'm sure other leaders would give you other choices.
No, I was interested in your opinion. And which one do you think helps Amazon to be ahead of competitors?
Wow. I'm looking through them. I mean, many of them do. I would probably say think big. Think big encourages leaders to try to think outside the box, to try to think outside of current constraints, and to try to think long term. And I think in so many companies, so many of Amazon's competitors, there's a huge focus on short-term profitability. I was in a meeting once where Jeff Bezos was arguing with his chief financial officer. And Jeff was approving or talking about approving expenses. And his chief financial officer was trying to slow him down a little bit. And he said, well, you know, Jeff, we only have so much money, which was like a relatively soft way of saying, be careful what you spend. But Jeff was having none of it. And he looked at his CFO and said, well, how much is that? I might want to spend it. Like he went right, like, well, how much? That CFO's name was Tom. And he said, how much is that, Tom? Because I might want to spend it. And it was a little bit of a jerk move, like, remember, I decide kind of thing. But it also just emphasized, I'm willing to take bets that other companies won't. And that, I think, is what set Amazon apart.
Do you think the principles work because the people that Amazon hire are embodying these principles, and these thoughts and everything? Or when they join, they are molded to accept them and to go by them?
So Amazon actually had, as the company grew, this was a big question. Can these principles be taught, or do we have to hire them? And I don't know exactly the process, but we had some psychologists weigh in on that. And we ended up with a rating of like, some of the principles you kind of have to hire. People are who they are by the time they're adults. Some of them can be like modified or polished in a mature professional, and some of them can totally be learned. Now, unfortunately, I can't itemize for you which ones were which perfectly, but the answer, unfortunately, is it's a mix. You have to hire for some of them, and then some of them can be tuned or improved. And those had to do a lot more with which ones were character traits versus which ones were behaviors. So I think, for example, one that's really hard to teach is about having backbone and really fighting for what you believe. But then if a decision to do something you don't believe is made, fully supporting it. People are usually good at one or the other. They're either good at, I'm going to fight and I'm going to keep fighting forever, or they're like, you're the boss, I'll do whatever. And that one, getting people who are okay fighting and losing and then going along is tough. So you kind of have to hire that.
I see.
I think, sorry, just quickly, the fact that these leadership principles are well known allows people to read them and decide, do I fit in Amazon or not? Because if you read these principles, there's very little on them there's relatively little that's warm and fuzzy. The company is transparent about, we're a very work-oriented culture. We're very hard charging. We're not necessarily mean or argumentative, but we care more about what's right than that everyone's happy. And so, at least it's transparently advertised.
During your years in Amazon, can you share some tips to people who are changing, to leaders who are changing the culture of their companies? What is the best approach to do that? The best approach so the culture can actually stick.
To change a culture, it actually turns out a lot of the basic research on changing cultures was driven by the U.S. Army. And the reason is the Army rotates its officers in any job every 2 years, but the units have existed for centuries. And so how do you keep consistent culture in something that you know for sure you're going to replace the leader every 2 years and replace most of the members every few years? And that turns out to be, to give practical tips, you have to make part of the culture into artifacts or systems that persist. So you have to build, if you don't like the culture of your company, you can't just talk about different things. You have to find some piece of how the company operates, how it rewards people, how it selects people, how the work is organized. You have to find something you can change that will actually support the new direction. And often that comes down to money or rewards. What behavior is rewarded? What behavior is paid for? For example, Amazon doesn't really pay for people to go to college. Like, that's a common benefit. And their viewpoint is, well, you make lots of money. You're a well-paid professional. If you want to go to college, go ahead. But it's not our job to pay. Other companies see that very differently as, oh no, our job is to support you in your educational aspirations. Well, if Amazon wanted to change, you'd add that benefit. And at some other company, let's say you felt you had too much culture that was about its benefits and its entitlements, you'd get rid of some of them, right? And that's how you would change the culture, is you would change what's rewarded and supported. The equivalent, and I think you come from a deep financial background, it's the equivalent in government of what do you tax and what do you subsidize? It's the same thing in a company, is what do you tax and what do you subsidize?
Sounds very, very, very simple, but in reality, it's not.
No, of course not, because incentives have unintended consequences.
Yeah.
In society and in companies.
Exactly. So you left Amazon 5 years ago, right?
Yes, four years ago.
4 years ago. Do you catch yourself sometimes thinking that, oh, this is the principle I'm applying? And do you still have this culture of thinking about these things? Because sometimes, bias to action, that's like my culture anyway.
So my wife makes fun of me because when I'm talking about Amazon, I often still say we as opposed to they. I spent the majority of my career there. I was very successful. I loved it. Many of my friends are from Amazon. And so we all talk in the same language, even if they've also left or moved on. Many of the people I coach or interact with online are either currently or formerly at Amazon. So I very much use these. And also, I think about them. I think about when I'm doing things for my own coaching and teaching business, I think about, how would Amazon do this? Now, I don't always feel I must do everything the same way, But I do think it's at least worth thinking, what would an Amazon leader do? What would Jeff Bezos do? Those are thought patterns I try to apply to give me perspective.
One last question. What do you think? I mean, there are many companies who read these principles and say, oh, I'm going to implement this and I'm going to implement that, but no other companies like Amazon. Why nobody succeeds?
So that's another thing we've wondered about. Amazon wonders why no one else has done the same thing. First, we don't know perfectly, but my belief is you have to do some of this from the start or from very early. What companies do is they get started and they let an organic culture form, and then they're big and they're busy and they want to change it. But, we know even in our personal lives, starting a new habit. So I promised myself I'm going to go for a 5-kilometer run every day. Well, maybe I do it, one day and then a second day, but the third day it never happens again. I think companies struggle. They're not Amazon today, and they struggle to become Amazon. The other thing goes a little bit to that cult piece. Amazon is a very strong culture that isn't the most pleasant in some ways. It's very effective, but not the most pleasant. And so just like you or I might want to be healthier, but joining an army training program where we run with backpacks wouldn't be our first choice of how to do it. When a company tries to become Amazon, they find themselves in one of these boot camps where they're trying to do all these things very differently, and they struggle. It's too much change. So I think we'll see other great companies. It's a long answer, and I apologize for that. I think a lot of it was Jeff Bezos, the founder, embodied so many of these for so long. You can't just have another company adopt these. It really would have to be the CEO who says, okay, I believe in these. I'm going to live by them. I'm going to hire and fire my own team of direct reports, my C-suite or vice presidents by them. And then you'd have to stick to that for 5 to 10 years. Then you could do it. No CEO that I know of has done that.
I see. So we have in Bulgaria, I'm Bulgarian, we have this saying that the fish starts to stink from the head.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the reverse of what you're saying. That obviously, if the CEO wants to do it, it will happen. If the CEO doesn't want to do it, it won't happen, no matter how much the people under them try and try and try.
I agree with that. I agree that if, within your own group or division, you can have short-term success, and through force of will, you can drive some modification from the overall company culture through great effort, but it will evaporate as soon as you leave because it's the CEO that's setting the overall culture. And I do think there's a lot of discussion, I'm sure you're aware, of the importance of founders versus hired CEOs. Founders are even stronger in this because they're there from the beginning, and founders can usually do things that others can't. CEOs are managed by a board and are usually managed to only their financial performance. Founders, particularly Jeff, was very willing to say, I don't really, of course I care about the financial performance, but I only care about it on a 10 or 20 year horizon. I don't care. Wall Street can punish us and make our stock lower. I don't care. And he could get away with not caring. A regular CEO doesn't get to do that. And so they can't take the same actions.
Well, that was yet another great discussion, Ethan. We are at the end of the second part of the podcast. Thank you so much for giving all these details and giving a lot of fruitful thought about company culture and how one can change it and what works and what doesn't work. So I'm thankful. Thank you so much for doing that. And I want to wish you all the very best.
Thank you so much. It was great to have another chance to share. I hope people get a lot of value out of understanding what Amazon does well and in their own company create their own version, hopefully from the beginning or from the CEO down, like you said.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Please hit subscribe to the show and leave a review or comment about how you find this episode.